Just be live. All right, we're live.
Good.
Hey, everybody, welcome to Talking Time with Caffeine, the only podcast where we talk about stuff. This is my new welcome to season 7 of the podcast. I'm doing a new thing this year where I'm getting guest stars, and I'm not doing a scheduled every week thing. I'm just doing when they're available thing. So might be a few days, might be a week or two between episodes. But my guest today, and introduce yourself, guest for today.
Hello, my name is Kyle. I study a lot of philosophy. I study especially the Bible. I would consider myself a theistic evolutionist. I'm a Christian. And today we're going to be discussing Genesis 1 and kind of go over the different interpretations of Genesis 1. So yeah, that's what we're going to be going over.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so let me start off with there's a distinction when it comes to different interpretations. There's like the most I can think of is like 8 or 9 different ones, and when it comes to, there's a distinction that needs to be made. So there's 2 different classes of interpretations. There's one, the concordist view, and then there's the non-concordist view. So let me try to simplify what that means. If you're a concordist, then your interpretation of Genesis 1 is going to try to align with scientific advancement. So if you're trying to read into the text, like you're going to say, oh, well, this text like means this in a scientific sense, right? Whereas a non-concordist would say like, no, you can't say that the Bible is predicting. You can't say that the Bible is like this science textbook that's telling us how the universe works. So that would be a non-concordist interpretation. I lean towards the non-concordist view, but I'm still going to go over each.
So basically, you don't think there are 6 literal days?
Well, we're going to get to that because there are non-concordist views that actually do agree that there is 6 literal days. And so let me just kind of go over.
Figure that. What was your journey? Because I'm a theistic evolutionist too. I don't think I was ever a young Earth creationist. I think I might have been an old Earth creationist a while back ago, because I used to read books about dinosaurs and stuff. So I'm like, they existed. I know that. Definitely not 6,000 years ago. But
no, so yeah, I know.
So I think I went from old Earth to theistic evolutionist. What was your journey?
Kind of the same. Well, I was a young Earth creationist for a month maybe, but then I went to an old Earth creationist.
Okay.
The biggest, I guess, hurdle was the kinds issue, and that took me a while to like get over that point. But yeah, I didn't hold to young Earth creationism for a long period of time. So it wasn't like I went from young Earth creationism to theistic evolution. Like I slowly I progressed toward that view. But yeah, so let me just kind of go over each one. So let me start off with the concordist interpretation. So you have, of course, young Earth creationism, which is the view that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago during a 6 literal 24 hours days, and that the creation account is actually describing a material creation. So like God literally created the world in 6 little days, and that's it. And the Earth is 6,000 years old, and that's pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
Then you have the gap theory, which is what I actually held to for quite some time, but then I switched over. But so the gap theory says that there's a distinction between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. And so while it's true that God created the universe 6,000 years ago, he didn't order, like before in Genesis 1:1, there's like a huge gap between 1 and 2. And so that gap would be like billions of years.
Yeah, I think that's what my pastor taught me, and then and that's why I think I older creationist, because I don't know what he got from, but he said like like Satan coming down was like it was like the meteor destroyed the dinosaurs, and the Earth was reset after that, or something like that.
No,
Like,
yeah,
so,
I held that view too. When I was an older creationist, I held that view. That's kind of how I still believed in the 6 literal days, but I made that, distinction between 1-1 and 1-2. So yeah, that was probably like my biggest interpretation at that time. Now there's another interpretation called the day-age interpretation, which says that each day in Genesis 1 corresponds to a long period of time. So, they would say that the days in Genesis are not 24/6 literal 24 hours a day, but rather each day is like could be billions of years or something like that. And that's kind of a lot of older creationists hold to that view as well. So
of course, there's always still the problem of the plant before stars and plant before the sun and stuff and all that other.
no, I know. Well,
stuff.
there's also the framework hypothesis, which I haven't really looked into that, but they try to fix that issue, I guess. I'm not going to get into it, but
Okay.
yeah, and that would be a concordance view as well. And then you have the appearance of age interpretation, which it's very weird because they say that the Earth was created 6,000 years ago in 24-hour days, but God created it in a way that made it look like it was really billions of years old. So it's kind of like God, even though God really did create the Earth 6,000 years ago, he made it seem like it's billions of years old. I find that very odd. That's probably like the oddest concordist view, I would say, because it makes God look like he doesn't like he's deceiving everyone. Like, oh, the Earth, it looks billions of years old, but it's really 6,000 years old. That's probably like not that many Christians hold to that. That just seems the most odd. And then now we have the non-concordist interpretations, which is the other category. So we have a lot of views here. Let me go to the simplest one. So this is actually what I held on to for a while, which was that I took Genesis 1 as like a poem. So rather than it being about the material creation, it was just a poem, and that the days are not like the whole chapter was just a poem, and that's it. Like it's not talking about material creation. It's not talking about any type of creation. It's just a poem about how God created the world, and that's it. Like it is not talking about anything to do with science, and that's why it's a non-concordist view. But that's kind of the gist of it, I guess. And then you have another non-concordist view would be the days of Genesis 1 took place in God's throne room. And so what happened was, from God's point of view, this is kind of like relativity, where from God's point of view, he was creating the world in 6 24-hour days, but from our point of view, it would be billions of years. So that would be that view. And the reason why it's non-concordist is because Genesis 1 is describing something that's happening outside space-time. So he's not like in space-time creating the universe. He's outside space-time creating it. And then from our perspective, it would just be, the natural history of the universe. And that's kind of that interpretation. Now, what's funny is that I don't hold to all the ones that I just mentioned. I don't hold to any of them. I don't hold to the Earth creationist interpretation. I don't hold to the age. I don't hold to the gap theory. I don't hold to the appearance. I don't hold to the poem interpretation. I don't hold to any of that. What I do hold to, however, is what's called the functionalist interpretation. And I know you mentioned earlier that, would you say that these 6 days in Genesis 1 are 24-hour days, or no? You would say they're not, right?
Well, I don't think they existed at all, but yeah.
Yeah, because for me, I would actually agree with creationists that the days in Genesis 1 are literal 24-hour days. The only thing I would disagree with them on is how they view the word create. And let me explain. So, under my interpretation is called the functional interpretation. I mean, there's different names for it, but I just call it functionalism because what it is basically it's saying that the word create in Genesis is not talking about creation in the material sense. It's talking about creation in a functional sense. So let me try to give you an analogy. So what that means is that in the ancient Near Eastern context, when Genesis 1 was written, they had no understanding of like how we would understand matter, or they didn't ask questions like where did space-time come from. Like when they wrote their creation myths, space-time was already there, matter was already there. They were only describing how God ordered it to be there. And so under my interpretation, when you take into account the ancient Near Eastern context, then what Genesis 1 is about, it's not talking about the material creation of the world. It's talking about the functional creation of the world.
Okay.
And what that simply means is that God ordered the cosmos and provided it functions and provided it status so that he can do what he pleases with it. And this is actually this is pretty new. Like this interpretation is pretty new when biblical scholarship. And the main proponent is John Walton. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No, the only Waltons I ever heard of were the Walton family on 70s.
Well, I got two of his books. He also wrote another book on the flood. But what his idea is that basically the word create is what's called a pre-Aristotelian view, which is that since Genesis 1:1 was, or Genesis 1, not 1:1, but since Genesis 1 was written before Aristotle, then there's no way that they could have had any understanding of like our way of cause and effect. Okay, because Aristotle invented what's called the Aristotelian causation, which is, our view that, where did space-time matter come from? Like our whole concept of thinking like creation came from that. Like, but it seems like the writers of Genesis 1 didn't have that understanding at all. And so what Walton argues is that because Genesis 1 is a pre-Aristotelian text, then it cannot be talking about material creations, but it has to be talking about functional creations, which is the view that God used pre-existing matter to bring about and provide functions to the cosmos. And what's funny is that if you actually read other passages, like if you read Exodus 25-31, if you read the building of the tabernacle, if you read the building of any, like when it constantly uses, especially in the Old Testament, when it constantly uses like, oh, they built this in 7 days or something. Well, they're using pre-existing material. It's not like they're creating God's temple out of nothing, right?
Yeah.
And so when you compare that Genesis 1, it actually makes sense. Is that Genesis 1 is not creation out of nothing, but it's talking about pre-existing material that was already there to kind of, for God to like set up his cosmos, to like set up his creation. And John Walton actually uses a pretty good analogy to this. So let's just say that you wanted to buy a restaurant. Okay, and you go into that restaurant before you buy it, and it's chaos, right? There's like, it hasn't been used in years, it's just there. But then you decide, oh, I'm gonna buy it. So then I'm gonna go in there, I'm gonna order it, I'm gonna make it a function, I'm gonna make it a restaurant again, right? Okay, but the restaurant was already there. So that's what God is describing in Genesis 1 is like the universe was already there. God just went in and made it the way, like he made it a function in the same way that we would want to go in and own a restaurant and make it a restaurant again. Well, God went into the universe and wanted to make it a universe again, at least in the ancient Near Eastern context. Okay, I'm not saying that God didn't create the universe that way. I'm just saying, like, when it comes to Genesis 1:1, that is how they would have understood it at the time. And so this is kind of the view that this is a pretty solid, like this interpretation seems to be more compelling. There's like, he provides a lot of arguments for it as well. There's been some criticisms of it, but they're pretty weak. And they seem to always forget the fact that Genesis is a pre-Aristotelian text, and that's the important part. Because Genesis is a pre-Aristotelian text, and there's no way that they would have like been even conceived of material creation in the same way that we would. And so if you're writing Genesis 1 from a, ancient Near Eastern context, then if you're talking about how God created the universe, that word create, when you write down, they're not thinking, oh, creation out of nothing. No, they're thinking God went into the universe and turned a chaotic universe into an ordered universe. And they would have understood that from their culture, from the time they lived in. And so that's kind of the view. Now, the one objection to that, I mean, it's pretty weak, but I have to bring it up, is that that the Israelites, the ancient Israel, that the reason that Genesis 1 is different than all the other ancient creation myths is because that they were against the culture at the time, which is true. They were against the culture, but they weren't against the culture in the way that they described how God created the universe. What they were against is the pagan gods. What they basically said is like, no, these pagan gods did not create the universe. God, our Yahweh in this case, created the universe and ordered the universe. So it's not these pagan deities that ordered the universe. It was our God, and that's it. Like, and it's funny because when you actually read Genesis 1 and compare it to like other creation myths, what other creation myths have is like when it's talking about like the sun and the moon, there's actual deities behind those things within those creation myths. But in Genesis 1, that's different because God set up all of it, not just parts of it, but all of it. And so that's when you get monotheism, and it's kind of like a response. So basically, Genesis 1 is like a response to the polytheists and the pagans at the time, and so that's kind of how I would respond to that.
Real fast. Hey, Pokesaurus in chat. You have any questions for Kyle?
I don't want to waste any more time, but
okay.
But yeah, that's the, I guess, view of it. There's been a lot of criticism of it, but that's the view I hold because it seems to be the best supported, and it takes into account the ancient Near Eastern context. And so young Earth create, like if I'm trying to compare that to the young Earth creationist interpretation, it's just not gonna compete.
Okay.
At all. And it doesn't, I mean, I'm not saying it's the best. It's just, it seems like it's like, it makes the most sense to me. Because because it is true, there have been a lot of, especially like the primary argument for creationism, at least from a biblical standpoint, is that the days in Genesis 6 were referring to 24-hour days. Okay.
Yeah.
And it is true, I would agree that it is referring to literal 24-hour days. The only problem is that they have their view of how creation is supposed to be defined is not correct. They're defining it in the wrong way. And so I would actually agree with creationists that yes, the Bible is describing, God creating the universe in 6 literal days, but it's not describing him creating it in a material sense. It's talking about a functional sense because that's what they would have understood at their time. And again, if you look at the rest of the Old Testament, that seems to be very consistent. And it also helps to better explain like day 7 of creation, because from a young Earth creationist perspective, like why would God need to rest on the 7th day? It doesn't make any sense. But from a functionalist perspective, it makes perfect sense, because that's how, like, day 7 is technically, it's the most important day of all the days of Genesis. Okay, because that is when God finally finishes his function. That's when he's finished making the whole universe into his temple, or his, and our, to make the restaurant analogy, it's like we finished making this a restaurant. So now we're going to go in there and we're going to actually run the restaurant. And in day 7, that's what God does. He goes into his creation and he rests, and
isn't that kind of like more like a deist view of the universe?
Well, no, I mean, again, we're not talking like how God actually created the universe. We're talking how how the writers of Genesis would have understood God to create the universe. Because again, we're not talking about like God going into the universe. We're only talking about how they would have understood it.
Okay.
Because they had no concept of like where space-time matter came from. So just from their culture, from their perspective, that's how they would have understood it.
All right. Speaking of that, do you think there's a difference between the stuff happening? I've heard this before, between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Those two different things, or the same thing?
No, well, Genesis 2 is a sequel to Genesis 1. Because if you look at Genesis, like when it's talking about, God made man in our own image, that's not referring to Adam and Eve. That's referring to mankind as a whole, because that's when God decided to make mankind his image. Now, we could talk about what the image of God means, if you want. Again, I take Walton's view on this, which is that the image of God is not, it's not something that's ontological. It's not like some people would say like, oh, it's our spirit, or oh, it's our rationality. Like, no, what it is, it's actually a status. Okay, it's what it is like God decides, okay, I'm gonna give you the status of being in my image, and you're supposed to be my representative on this planet. And so that's what the image of God is, and that's why God told Adam and Eve to subdue the earth, to make the earth a better place. And another thing about that is that the earth was not perfect after God created it, because there's this very big misunderstanding that the earth was 100% perfect when Adam and Eve were put in the garden. Like, the garden may have been perfect, but the earth as a whole was not perfect. Okay, we can get into that, but yeah, there's a lot of like bad
the belief
views.
that some of the younger Christians believes that all the animals were vegetarians, and
no,
Tyrannosaurus ate watermelons and all that.
It's just completely wrong. It's just so like, no, like that's not how any of this works at all. We could get, okay, I'll get into Genesis 2 and 3. Okay, let's start off with death, okay, because that seems to be another issue within that subject. So the creationists would say that there was no death before the fall. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's funny is that whenever there's only a few passages that bring this up. Okay, if there was no death before the fall, then why did God put the tree of life in the garden?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's the problem, because the answer is that there was death before the fall. That's why he put it there.
I always figured that back then, when I was thinking about that they could die. Eating the fruit just made them.
Now, some people would say that. Okay, here's the only counter argument that you would that they would make is like, okay, well, what about when they sin, like death fell behold them? It's like, okay, yeah, fine.
Well, I guess they had to keep eating. My opinion is, I guess they had to keep eating the fruit to keep the immortality. That was my opinion at the time, at least. And once they got separated from the fruit, then the countdown to destruction began.
No, but here's the thing about that, is that when it talks about like sin or death being the consequence of sin or whatever, that's because they lost access to that tree of life. It's not that they lost the immortality, it's that they lost access to that tree of life. And so that's why they lost their immortality, that they were going to get immortality.
That's why I said
they lost it, and they die, and now they have to face death because they lost access to tree of life.
They're no longer the Highlanders.
Yeah. And so that's kind of like the whole point. Yeah. So I think that kind of, I don't think you can't really argue against that, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, another thing, I guess, would be the flood, because I know that's very related. So let me try to, I'm going to have to really break this down, because a lot of people have this. There's a lot of good arguments on both sides, but a lot of bad arguments on both sides. Okay. I would agree.
Real fast, I always thought the flood even existed is like it's a local thing, definitely not a worldwide thing.
Well, yes, I would agree with that too. Hold on, let me see if I can. There's a section in this book that talks about it. Okay.
Yeah, real fast. Yeah, I always, even when I still believed in the flood as a thing, like it didn't make sense to me because in my back when I still believed in the literal thing, I'm like, well, the Bible says it's happened, so it has to be true. But then again, how could Native Americans be in America 10,000 years across your landwoods if the flood happened 4,000 years ago? That doesn't make any sense at all. How can that like my head can comprehend it?
Well, what's important to remember is that you need to understand the genre of Genesis. And so the genre of Genesis is actually what's called theological history. So what that means is that like it actually did happen, but you need to understand it from their perspective. You need to understand it from their what's called culture river, like ancient Near Eastern context. Again, you have to understand their culture to really understand. I can't find, but yeah, I would agree with you that there was a flood. I don't think. Now, I'm undecided actually on how big the flood was. But first of all, I know it didn't cover the whole earth. I know that. I just don't know how small it was or I'm undecided when it comes to that issue. But I do think there was a flood. I just don't know like which flood it was that they're referring to.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I have to really look more into that, which is why I have this huge book. It's like freaking 650 pages long. It basically, yeah. And it goes.
It's on your computer, so you can screen share it.
Well, I don't. It's right here.
Oh.
So, yeah. That's kind of, I guess, my what I'm trying to study. But I was trying to find this one passage that went over it, but I can't find it. Okay.
That's a lame joke, Pokesaurus.
Yeah, let me just see. Okay. Okay, so if you go to, there's other, I can't find it. I give up. If you read Genesis, and I'm talking like the later chapters of Genesis, like where this is way past Genesis 1, it actually does refer to like when there's a plague. I can't remember again. It refers to like the plague covered the whole world. Well, obviously the plague didn't cover the whole world. Like you don't have people like in South America that are dying or like dealing with this plague or this catastrophe. Like you can't. So it's the same language that what it's saying is like it's talking in a so the language does imply that the flood was global, but it was global from their perspective, which means again that it was local, it was regional. Now I'm not saying it was definitely big. The flood was pretty big. It was not this flood that only affected a few towns here and there. Like no, this was a really big flood that affected a lot of people, but it was not a global flood. It would be similar. Okay, it would be similar to let's say like this disease that hit America or something, right? And like, there's a lot of people dying, and so this disease is going to kill the whole world. Well, obviously, it's not going to kill the whole world. It's gonna affect a lot of people, but it's not going to kill everyone in the world.
Okay.
So that's kind of my view of the flood, is that at least when it comes to the language. Now, whether how big the flood was, I don't know. I honestly have no idea how big the actual flood was. I believe it happened. I just don't know exactly the magnitude at which it happened at. But I will say that the language does imply that they thought it was a global flood, even though it really wasn't a global flood in the literal sense, at least in the. So I think the important thing to remember when it comes to that is that you can't. It's like trying to reconstruct like some psychology analysis from reading like ancient literature. Like, you're not going to be able to understand the psychology of how they thought, and so you can't reconstruct this psychological framework from like reading ancient text. So then therefore you can't reconstruct a literal flood in a scientific sense from the events described in Genesis. And so that's kind of my view.
Okay.
So yeah, and then again, now that we're past the flood, then we go to the Tower of Babel, which, I mean, most scholars at this point, that was not. I don't think there's any creationist. I mean, there's very little scholarly support for the creationist view on that, so I'm not even gonna go over that because it's not taken seriously at all. But so yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
Okay.
So yeah, that would be kind of my summary of Genesis 1. But if we want to talk more, you can. If you have any more questions, we can, or you can switch the topic to something else if you want.
Well, let's come back to Genesis 1 real fast. How you? What's the deal? I missed before. What's the deal with how they do the I can't explain it to myself. Like I said before, like the is there a purpose of the way they put stuff in there, like the plants before light and stuff, and flying stuff before wind stuff, and all that stuff?
No, because they haven't read any scholars. Here's another thing. This is really important, especially when it comes to my view of Genesis. If you actually, and there's a okay, let me try to clarify first, okay, because this is really important that I almost forgot about, but luckily I remembered. Okay, so when it comes to translations, okay, when it comes to, like, you've heard there's the King James translation, there's the New International Version translation, there's like, I don't know how many translations, there's like 50, 60, 70. There's a lot of different translations out there that like they use the same they have the same meaning, but there's like different words to describe like the Bible, right? And so like if you actually look at different translations, you're gonna see the same meaning, but you're gonna have different words to describe that, right? Okay, here's the thing, is that especially, okay, let me take the example of John 3:16. Okay, if you go to the King James version, it will say, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son." Okay, that word begotten there, that was not in the original language. That word begotten, so they got rid of it. So they put God's only son. Okay. Now what happened was that you had a bunch of King James onlyists complain that, oh, they're trying to change the Bible. They're trying to change God's word. When no, they're not changing God's word. What they're doing is they're looking at earlier manuscripts and they're finally like, oh, well, this part was added later, so let's get rid of it. Right? And so you have this.
Yeah, because it's been through Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, to whatever
No,
language.
no, but here's the thing: is that when it comes to King James version, like King James onlyists, they would like they think that their translation is the perfect translation, right? Well, that's not true. it's actually a pretty bad translation.
Mm.
Like there's a lot of research that has gone into New Testament, Old Testament scholarship and biblical studies and exegesis. That at this point, the King James version is not taken seriously. Like I'm not saying it's terrible, but it's just it's not like there's a lot more we know now that we don't really need it anymore. Like that was good for their time, that was good for the 16th century, but at this point we know a lot more. We have a lot more manuscripts, and so we can better accurately tell what the originals might have said. Okay, it's not perfect, but we can, like, we've done a lot of research on this. We have a lot more evidence.
Okay.
We have a lot more data. And so when they got rid of that, there was a huge like battle over that. And so that's an example of like there has to be compromises in translations, because if you change something that's like controversial, then it's going to cause a lot of problems. And that's what happened in the King James version, onlyists, when they were complaining that that we're trying to change the Bible, and like we're trying to like corrupt God's word because the only King James version is the best and nothing else. And I bring that up because what happens if we try to change something that's controversial with regards to Genesis 1? You think that's bad? Oh no. You try to change Genesis 1, people are going to go absolutely insane.
Like what people?
The younger creationists.
Oh.
Like they're gonna lose it. Like you think changing John 3:16 is bad? No. You try to go back and change it to fit what the original might have said in Genesis 1:1. Oh no. So there has to be compromises, right? And it's funny because if you actually, there's a lot of scholars that argue this, that the very first, that Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, that the word "in the beginning" is not supposed to be there. It's supposed to say when God created the heavens and the earth. And there's been a lot of doctrinal theses that have argued that extensively. It's just, the problem is that if they change it to, like, if they were to like come up with some translation that actually presented what the original Genesis might have said, it would cause so much controversy that you would have a lot of Christians be really pissed off, because they would try to say like, oh, you're trying to change God's word to fit evolution or something like that. And so that's why they don't do it, even though it's really a secret within Old Testament scholarship. They don't put it on those translations because it would be so controversial that they just can't do it. At least not right now. I mean, they might be able to in the future, but right now they can't do it because it would cause too many problems. So yeah, my point is that the very first verse of Genesis is not supposed to say, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. What it's actually supposed to say in the original Hebrew is when God created the heavens and the earth. And so if it actually says that, if it says when God created the heavens and the earth, then any creationist interpretation on that would fall apart, because what you would be having is God just ordering creation from pre-existing material. You see my point?
Yeah.
So that's why, like, it would cause too much controversy, so they don't do it, basically. Now, I can't. Here's the thing: is like I can't say that it's totally like that, because there's good scholars on both sides on this issue, but it seems like that's where the evidence is heading, as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
And it's the same thing with like how you define the word create. Like, in the criticisms of John Walton in the literature are terrible. They're pretty bad. Trust me, I try to look at both sides of an argument, and it seems like the arguments against at least my functionalist interpretation, the one I hold to, is just they're not good at all. They're pretty bad. So I'm not.
So how did you find this John Walton guy, and what made you pick his view of the?
Well, I was doing a lot of research and I was trying to like, figure out, okay, well, what's the best view? And I made that distinction like I did earlier with the concordist and the non-concordist. And I eventually just realized like his interpretation seems to be the most compelling because it seems to fit with the entire theme of the rest of the Old Testament. And it makes way more sense, especially when you consider day 7 and how he explains it. He explains it and it makes much more sense under his view than under like a creationist view. And any other view, basically, I think. I mean, not any other view, but any concordist view would make way more sense under a functionalist interpretation than any concordist interpretation.
Right.
But you understand like what I mean by concordism, right? It's just a class of interpretations. So
I think so.
yeah, okay. Because under my functionalist interpretation would be a non-concordist. It would be classified under that one. So.
So anything else about Genesis you want to talk about?
I think we covered pretty much most of it.
Okay.
We could, okay, well, related to that though is evolution.
Okay.
There's been a lot of research done into that. I know, especially within the past like 4 years since I've become a theistic evolution, there's like been a lot more data to come out. How do I put this? Okay, when it comes to God actually creating the universe, so ignoring Genesis 1, I would consider myself a naturalist. I would consider myself a theistic naturalist. So what that basically means is that God is not some supernatural being that exists like outside nature, but he is kind of like the ground of nature. So I would be like a classical theist, basically, where now I'm not saying that God is in space time. Like I'm not saying like God's like Thanos or something like that.
So
Where
you like okay, maybe for a question then. Do you think God like just let nature does his thing, or does he like guide it along?
No, he guides it. Yeah, that's the thing. But I want to clarify that. Okay,
kind of like a dog, almost like a dog breeder, like he breeds certain animals.
Yeah, let me try to clarify what my view on that. So, I define nature as all that exists. Okay, because I'm a naturalist, right? But I say that God is outside of space-time. So what that means is that my definition of nature extends beyond space-time. Okay. So God would be outside space-time. So he's not bound by our physical laws. He's not bound by, he doesn't have he's not bound by any of our natural laws within the universe. But he exists outside the universe. He's not supernatural. He's natural, but he created space-time and matter. Like I'm talking classical space-time matter. I'm not talking quantum mechanics or anything. I'm just talking Newtonian physics and Newtonian gravity. That's all I'm talking about. Okay, just our general experience of the world.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to quantum mechanics and general relativity, there's a lot more. There's a lot more connectiveness there. There's a lot more. How do you say it? Like, there's my. How would I say it? I would say that God is. I wouldn't say he's part of the quantum realm because the quantum realm is kind of outside space time in a way, especially when you get into like quantum gravity. But he's the ground of that.
Okay.
So basically, if I'm going to summarize my view, I think that we live in the matrix in God's mind. I think we live in a mental universe that there is no physical stuff. There's no mind independent stuff that exists out there. Everything is a mental construct. And I'm not talking social constructs. I'm talking like, we basically live in God's dream, God's mind, or whatever you want to call it. And so that would be kind of my view, and that kind of helps, you know, people to understand like why I can consider myself a naturalist even though I'm a theist. And so, have you ever heard of panentheism?
Panentheism. Is that like the same as panspermium?
No, it's different. Okay, so let me try to clarify. So pantheism is the view that the universe and God are one. Panentheism is different in that it says that that God transcends the universe, but that he sustains it. And so, under my view, I would say that God sustains the universe because the universe is like emergent from God's mind, basically. So that would be my view. That's why I would consider myself a naturalist. And so I would say that God, he guides the universe through natural law. So he guides evolution through natural law. He guides literally anything through natural law. Okay. So my view of evolution is what's called process structuralism. So I actually don't accept neo-Darwinism. And there's a lot of evidence against neo-Darwinism. I'm not going to get into that. But my view of evolution is process structuralism, where instead of evolution being driven by random genes and random variations, the main driving force of evolution is natural laws, and that ever since the Big Bang started, life was inevitable, basically, and more specifically, human life was inevitable. So not only was life inevitable, not only was it destined for life to arise from non-life, but humans were inevitably going to come about.
So basically, kind of like I said before, like God, you're thinking like God. Basically, you're saying that he like triggered each event to make sure like
What he did,
speciation and breeding each creature together until we appeared.
Yeah, and he used natural law. So I wouldn't say it's intelligent design. But I would say, I mean, it is kind of intelligent design in the sense of like there's intervention, but the way he intervenes is not like, you know, magic, but he actually uses natural law.
Okay.
And then now when it comes, I could talk about miracles, but because I have my own, I think miracles are also natural.
Okay. You can if you want to, if you're finished with that subject, or continue that subject for.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about. Well, we can talk about it later, but okay. So my view is that God pretty much programmed the universe, and that all the life forms that we see on Earth were inevitable from the start, and like there's no other direction that evolution could have gone. That if you were to restart the entire history of life, if you were to restart all of life on Earth, you would have gotten the same result. So it's not like if you were to restart it, you would get something different. No, you would get the same result. You would still get humans, you would still get cats, you would still get dogs. Like you would still, like it's inevitable.
Still get viruses, still get bacteria, still get
everything. Okay, so
plants.
Yeah. There is no like it. We basically what I'm saying is like I don't think that we were here by accident. I think that since the Big Bang that we were inevitable from the start, and that we are not just accidents of nature. And I would actually say that the origin of life works the same way. That the origin of life is not some random accident that just happened. Like just it's not like just a bunch of chemicals just came together and whoop, you have life. No. It was inevitable from the start, and it was inevitable because there's natural laws that govern the universe that bring about life from non-life, and that was going to happen regardless.
Okay.
And then, have you ever heard of something called No, wait, not. I just mentioned structuralism, but have you ever heard of something called convergent evolution?
I think I have. It sounds familiar, but I don't
What it
remind.
is, okay, so what it is basically convergent evolution. What it is like there you have different life forms that get the same features, but yet they don't have a common ancestor, or at least they have like very distant common.
Okay. Is that like both birds and bats and insects all have wings thing?
Yeah, so like let me try to. So what it is like it's the environment that made them have those features. It wasn't fully, now genes were involved obviously, but their genes weren't fully involved. That the environment was more involved in that sense than their genes.
Kind of like like the fish.
Yeah. So yeah.
Whales and ichthysauruses all have similar designs.
Yeah, and they don't have a common ancestor. At least their common ancestor is like way back to where you couldn't like actually make. There wouldn't be enough genes to make that connection. And so okay, let me try to break it down to you. So just as eyes evolve in response to light, like they're gonna have the same structures. Eyes are all gonna have the same structures depending on which light they're perceiving. Okay, wings would evolve in response to air. Okay, and I'm gonna start to really get into something that that people need. This is gonna be crazy. But when you talk about let's say the human brain, okay. Now the human brain, as far as we know, is the most complex organ in the universe. Not just on planet Earth, but like it's the most complex organ ever. We still have really very little understanding of it. We know a few good things about it. We just we don't know like exactly how it works. There's some good ideas we could maybe talk about. Like I've studied free will when it comes to neuroscience, but let's talk. We don't have to talk about that. But
Okay.
So just as eyes would evolve in response to light, wings would evolve in response to air. Now, our brains are intelligent, right? So what would our brains evolve in response to? The environment, right?
Air stimuli, our environment, yeah.
Okay, but what about our intelligence? What did that evolve?
Situations?
Right, but what I'm saying is how did we get that intelligence in the first place? It can't be our genes because of convergence. And there's a lot of other creatures that they might not be as smart as we are, but they still they have a sense of like rationality to them. Like you even have dolphins that are that have rationality to them, but yet we're not genetically related to them. So what I would say, and this is something that that I can't remember his name, but there was one biologist that said this is like, just as eyes can evolve in response to light, wings can evolve in response to air. The brain, the intelligent brain that we have, evolves to something equivalent to mental air.
Mental air?
And yeah, so let me explain. And what he said is like, what I mean by that metaphorical term is those a priori truths that are already part of the universe, like mathematics, logic, universal truths, stuff like that. And so what he concluded from that was that evolution basically shows us, or at least not all of evolution, but like the evolution of intelligence shows us that there has to be some pre-existent intelligence that exists out there in our environment so that our brains can evolve in response to that environment.
Okay.
And so what that concludes is that our universe already possesses this mental reality that's not physical, something that's not made of matter, because what he also said this. Okay, he said that there can be no intelligence without intelligibility, and there can be no knowledge without a priori intelligibility. And what he admitted was that the logic of this leads to idealism, which is basically my view of the universe, which is that we live in a universe that's mental, and that there's these mental realities that exist out there, and that's all that really exists, and that the ideal and the mental exists prior to the material, and that the material kind of emerges from that mental reality that we experience every day, because we're all human beings, we're all smart, we all have intelligence, right? We all have this sense of knowing things, and this sense of like, our subjective experiences, and I mean, if you really think about it, like, that's all we know. We only know our subjective experiences.
Okay.
Like, we only know our perceptions. We only know what we can think of, and like all of our knowledge derives from that. And so what he concluded was that the universe, like, that's all that exists, is mental. There's no physical reality, or there's no like non-mental reality that exists, that's out there, that's non-intelligent. Like, there's always going to be this intelligence in the universe, and that's how the universe works.
Okay.
Like, we live in like this mental reality, this kind of like dream, so to speak. And so I would say that evolution is pretty strong evidence for the existence of God, or at least naturalistic pantheism, theistic, whatever you want to call it. Not if you want to call it theistic naturalism or whatever. I mean, you can call it what you want, but it seems like evolution provides pretty strong evidence for theistic naturalism.
All right.
I don't know. What do you say?
Just interesting. I don't know what to say. I'm not really good.
I know we could talk about it more later, but I mean, that's what I just described to you is kind of what I've been researching these past few years, and why I'm like way ahead with regards to
Okay.
arguments for God's existence. Now there are bad arguments for God, right? Bad arguments on both sides. So I mean, I'm not gonna deny, like, if someone can provide a better explanation, then so be it. Like, then I'll become an atheist if you can provide a better explanation of the evidence. But until then, I mean, and there's a lot of other things I can talk. I can get into quantum mechanics. I can get into like, but I'm not going to discuss that right now. But there's a lot more arguments that you can get into with regards to that. I'm not gonna. I could even, if I wanted to. I mean, I would have to be on here for another few hours. I could explain to you how you get from the hard problem of consciousness to Christianity. I'm not going to get into it because it's a really long process.
Probably for another time for another podcast.
Another podcast. Yeah, I'm not going to do it tonight. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because when 4 years ago, when I did, when I became a theistic evolutionist, like, even in the hangout that we had at the time, I made a distinction between the natural and the supernatural. I made that distinction at that time. Like, I, said like, oh, there's just natural and there's supernatural, which is God. Well, I don't really make that distinction anymore. Like, I still do, but it's very arbitrary.
So your opinions have changed since that?
Oh, yeah.
4 years ago?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I know a lot more now. I met a lot more people. There's a lot more I've studied. I wanted to get into the hard problem of consciousness, but I'm not going to do that tonight.
Can you simplify it? Can you simplify it?
Yeah, okay, so let me try to. Okay, so the hard problem of consciousness, it it basically it's a problem for how does the brain produce subjective experience. And what I mean by that is I'm not saying that the brain is not involved in subjective experience, okay? Like if you damage the brain, you damage your like like there's been cases where like you would damage the brain and it would like literally change people's personalities. It would change their political views. It would change like everything, almost everything about them, right? Like
Yeah.
there's been actual studies on that. Okay, so the mind and the brain are very, very intertwined. They're like molded together. Okay.
Okay.
Now I could talk about free will, but just to talk about the hard problem for now. Okay. When it comes to the hard problem of consciousness, it's how is it that all of those experiences in the brain, how does that equate to your subjective experience of the world? And what I mean is if I were to go into your brain right now, I wouldn't find the feeling and sensation. I wouldn't find the feeling of like I wouldn't be able to see what you see. Like I can't go inside your consciousness. Okay, I can't like go inside your consciousness and make you force you to have a choice, right? Now what I could do, okay, this is one thing I could do. I could open your brain up and like make you involuntarily move your arms or something like that. But I can't change your will. I can't go into your consciousness and like take over your free will and be like, oh, I'm gonna make you do this or that.
Like brainwashing.
Yeah, I can't do that. No, not even brainwashing, but like I can't go into your actual consciousness and like make you control your free will to make you consciously do something, basically. Again, I can involuntarily cause you to do stuff, but I can't make you voluntarily do stuff.
What's the
Okay?
difference?
At least from a biological perspective.
What's the difference in involuntarily do something, making you me and doing it
Yeah, yeah.
involuntarily?
I know, what I'm saying is like, okay, let's say if you're laying down, okay, and I opened your skull up and you're still awake, and
Yeah.
I know I'm just thinking, and I did something with your brain that I caused your hand to involuntarily move, okay, and I
Okay.
caused your whole body to involuntarily move. Okay, but you were not in control of that.
Yeah.
So, but I can't go and make you like I can't go again, I can't go into your consciousness, I can't go into your subjective experience and cause you to freely decide to do things. Now, if I could do that, that would be different, but I can't. In fact, they've actually done studies on this. They've actually tried to do it multiple times. Like that's one of the predictions. You know, if the hypothesis that the brain produces the mind is true, like that's what we would expect, but that has backfired pretty
Then,
hard.
so then what's brainwashing then? That's even a thing.
No, that's not brain. No, I'm not talking brainwashing here. I'm talking neurobiologically going into your brain and
Okay.
causing you to do things. I'm not talking brainwashing. It's a whole different
Okay.
subject because then in that case I'm manipulating your choices, but I'm not
Okay.
necessarily controlling your free will.
Okay.
But so the hard problem is how is it that all your brain processes um, like how does that give you subjective experience? And the best way I could describe it is what's called the P zombie argument. So the P zombie argument is that there is this person, there's Lamont, that you have like this twin zombie that does everything you do. It thinks the same exact ways you do, but guess what? You are that person is not conscious at all. So it acts the same exact way you do, but it's not conscious.
Okay.
And so that's the P zombie argument. And so that's an issue for materialism, at least for reductionism. I can't say all materialism because there is like non-reductive approaches to it, but that's the problem. Is you can't like there's no equating between the two. And here the other thing is that people would say like, oh, you can just add complexity, right? You can just add complexity to the brain, just add more and more stuff to the brain, right? Well, that doesn't really work, because if you keep on adding complexity, you keep on adding like these systems upon systems of the brain, that's never going to give you subjective experience. That's just going to keep on going back to that p-zombie problem. Like, there's just no way that you're ever going to ever be able to like, that's never going to produce subjective experience. And so that's the problem. That's the hard problem.
Okay.
I don't think there is a hard problem, because I'm not a materialist. I'm not a reductionist. I'm an idealist. So I think that consciousness is primary. So rather than the brain producing consciousness, I think consciousness produces the brain. So I don't think there is a hard problem. But but if you hold to the view that the brain produces consciousness, then you're going to face the hard problem. And again, there's I have David Chalmers' books that talk about it.
Who's David Chalmers?
He's the one that writes on the hard problem. I have both of them. I read both of them. He goes over a lot of like models of the brain that have tried to like get consciousness to be like emergent from the brain, but he's pretty much shown why in each case the hard problem still remains. Like, even if we could completely describe how the brain works, you're never going to be able to describe that subjective experience, simply because consciousness, you can't reduce consciousness. It's not reducible. It's irreducible, basically. And so that's the hard problem.
Okay. So what other topics you want to talk about?
I think that has been an hour.
Yeah, but you can. I said at least an hour, but you have something else that you keep going on. It's fine with me.
No, I think I'm pretty much burned out at this point. But yeah, that's, I mean, my view. I'm a naturalist, so I do think that God is a natural being, but again, I still think he's a maximally great being. Okay, let me try to simplify this the best way I can. Let's see here. I'm actually gonna get my old what's it called? Google Slides real quick. Let's see here. Just give me one moment. I'm gonna do something.
Okay.
All right, let's see here. I'm gonna skip over these parts. Okay. All right. So before I begin, let me screen share. Can I screen share? Oh yeah, I can. Yeah. Okay, hold on. All right. Let's see here. How was I gonna? Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's. Okay. All right. So first of all, before I need to skip these parts. Okay. So if we're in God's mind, okay, then we would we would be in His mind, right? When you would agree with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So under my model, I should say, is that under my model of God, you necessarily are going to get to some Christian idea of salvation. Because here's the thing: is that if before God created the universe, if it was just God and it was just His consciousness and that's all that existed, like basically a solipsism where it's like it's only you, then you would necessarily have it where God is the good, okay? And the reason why is because you can't have evil exist on its own. So like let's take the example of like maximal. I'm gonna stop sharing real quick. Okay. If we take the example of maximal evil, okay, one of the properties of maximal evil is called maximal selfishness. And under maximal selfish, I can't say it. How do you say it?
Selflessness.
Yeah. No, not selflessness. It's
Self.
selffulness. Yeah. So you're totally selfful. So you only care about yourself. And if God is maximally evil, then he would have to be fully like selfful. And if that's the case, then he wouldn't want to share his existence with anyone. So he wouldn't create anything. Right.
Okay.
And so basically what it boils down to is like God has to be the good, like from logical necessity, because evil is always going to be like, it's always going to be grounded in the good. And so then God has to be the good. And so since God has to be the good, okay, I'm gonna screen share again. Since God has to be the good, then his value set is going to be like true, or it's going to be like the objective value set. Now, I mean, we could talk about ethics, but a value set, how I define it here, is like your subjective. A value set is like how you judge what's good and bad. So if like let's say if you were to see someone get killed, like you would have, certain judgment upon that. And so everyone has a value set, right? You would agree with that?
Yeah.
Everyone has like their subjective view of what's good and what's bad. But in this case, if we're all in God's mind, then there's what's called a universal value set, which is, God's value set. And then since our minds are the product of God's mind, since he created us, then our sense of value would derive from God's sense of value. So thus God also has a sense of value. Now this is the other thing, this kind of gets over the, have you ever heard of the Euthyphro dilemma? Where
No.
if God, okay, what it is, okay, let me explain it in simple terms. Is like, is God good because, is God the good because it's good, or is he good? Like basically what it is like, if God is good, then is it because there's like this ultimate goodness that's beyond him, or is it because he's just deciding what's good?
Okay.
So this actually helps to solve the problem, which is that God's sense of value is subjective, but it is universal since his mind contains all of existence. So God's sense of value must be universally intersubjective since all value sets come from God's. So what is universally intersubjective is epistemically objective. So God's value set would be objective. And so then if you were to disagree with this value set, then you would be objectively bad because he's objectively good. You would be objectively bad if you disagreed with his value set. So again, if we start at the beginning, we have one mind with one value set. And this value set would have to be universally good. And this God causes a good creation. But since under theistic idealism, which is, theistic naturalism, nothing can exist outside of God's mind, but evil would exist only as an absence of the good, or absence of God, in a separation or break in the original design. And so again, if we go back to like Adam and Eve, for example, like that was when like that was when it started breaking, and that's when the fall came around, and that's why we have a deprived nature, and that's why evil exists. Like, I could talk about the problem. Well, actually, the problem evil is relevant here.
Okay.
We'll talk. I'll get to that one last piece at the very end before I get off.
Okay.
But the minds that cause this break would exist in God's mind, but they would be disconnected from the rest of God's mind. So the explanation of value sets that are different than God's value set is explained by the ego, aka fallen state, sin, in which the minds are corrupted by sin. And so that would explain evil, at least in an objective sense. Again, the ego is the separation from God. And so here's the important thing is like, and this is kind of the whole purpose of religion. Okay, when you think of religion, like it has really nothing to do with like going to church. It has everything to do, however, with salvation, right?
Mm.
Like literally, religion could not exist. Like if you were a Muslim, like you're going to church not because you want to give them money or like not because you want to help them, but like literally you're going there and you believe in that religion because you want to be saved. You want salvation, right?
Yeah.
That is like there's no other like more important thing than salvation when it comes to religion. Like religion would not exist without that, right?
Okay.
Okay, so all religion's goal, okay, every religion on the planet goal is to escape this fallen state and to go into the holy state, which is connected to God, to be saved from sin. Or, I mean, they have a different word. So, like, if you have, like, the Hindus would call it karma or something like that. But, like, if you look at the definitions, like, of what they're trying to escape from, it all basically means the same thing. Like this separation from God, like this it's like they're trying to get back to God and it's not working out, and so their religion is like, oh, I'm trying to get back to God, right? So
Okay.
so that would be so what their basic goal is to try to like get their value sets the same as God's value set so that they can be holy again, or you know be connected or whatever. And so that's the important thing.
All right.
Now, there's different models of salvation. So you have the religious model, which is these models are found in Islam, Judaism. It's based on legalism, which is that you go to heaven not because like you were changed, but rather because you are trying to do good works and stuff like that. The only problem though is that you're doing it from within your ego. You're doing it within your fallen state.
Okay.
So that's a problem. And then the Eastern model is that you try to prepare this. So there's two stages. There's you prepare the soul, and then the upward flight to God. This is mostly found in like Eastern religions. It's not salvation by works, but works are used to prepare the soul for second state. So you work to prepare the soul. So at first you're working, okay, but then the second stage is still done within the ego. So yes, it does focus on spiritual development rather than external actions, but the problem is that the second stage, which is the upward flight
Ugh.
of the soul to God, that's still done within your ego. So while you were doing good works, now that you're trying to like get to God, you're still getting to God in the wrong way. You're still trying to get to God with your ego, with that fallen state.
Like ego, like the ego super ego thing.
Yeah, well, I'm not talking, but that's the best way I can describe it is the ego. Like you're trying to get out of the ego, but the problem is that in the Eastern model, at least, is like you're trying to get to God, but you're doing it with your fallen state still intact. That's the problem. So both of these models don't work. So what I kind of figured out is like if it's the case that theistic naturalism is true, um, like both of these ideas do not work. So you can't be saved through works, and you cannot be saved by any like at least these Eastern religions.
All right.
However, there's a third salvation model, which is the Christian model. So this model focuses on inner transformation rather than external works. Now, unlike the Eastern model, the Christian model says that God initiates the transformation rather than the ego. So it's not the ego trying to fix the ego, rather it's God fixing the ego. Okay. So it's like you can't change yourself, basically.
Okay.
So salvation is a gift to fix ego rather than the ego trying to fix itself. And that's kind of the whole point is like the ego can't fix itself, so it needs God to do it. And that's the only way that you could actually get saved.
All right.
Like there is no, like it doesn't matter how many times, like you can go to any preacher, you can go to like You could meditate for a year. You could go on acid. You could freaking do ridiculous amounts of religious like rituals. You can do whatever you want. But guess what? You're never gonna get out of the ego. You're never gonna get out of it. The only being that is gonna get you out of it is God. That is the only being. That is the only way you're gonna possibly get out of it. Okay, and that's the important part.
All right.
So you could dedicate your entire life to like endless rituals and like, you know, when you go to Hinduism or India, like they, you know, they do a lot of rituals, they, you know, stuff like that. They try to like get out of the ego, but they can't because, well, you're still doing it within the ego. It's like this vicious cycle that just never ends. And so
What is the ego anyways?
it's the fallen state.
Okay.
So the ego, so it's like, so what it is like it's when your value set is disconnected from God's value set. That's what the ego is. And it's basically what, like, that's how sin is defined.
All right.
So that's what the ego is. Let's see here. So look at the ego suggests that it cannot fix itself. And so our ego is separate from God, so it's broken that only God can fix it. God does not have ego, but he has an identity separate from us. What causes / defines the separation is sin. And so what ultimately divides us from God would be sin. And so only the Christian model can fix this ego we have within us, basically. And now it's so like, you don't even like necessarily need, the thing about this is like, when I realized this a while back, I realized like you don't even necessarily need, like you can just get all of Christian theology from theistic idealism.
Okay.
So God has to die to his own identity and separation from us, even though he has no privation of his own. And so what's left for us is to die to our own egos. And then, you know, after that, that's when your connection to God is restored. So you have to like, and I'll explain that in a moment when we talk about the problem of evil, but
Okay.
that's the only way you're going to like be able to get back to God, basically. So yeah, that's kind of it.
And so, and then the evil thing is your last subject.
Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna try to explain this in the best way I can. Okay, so before we talk about, well, actually, they're both relevant. Okay, I was gonna talk about heaven and hell before, but they're actually relevant. And then I'll close off with just a summary statement.
Okay.
So the problem of evil. Okay. And I feel like free will is going to be involved. So I'm going to explain the brain, and I'm going to have to address
Like free will and fate and destiny and stuff.
Yeah. Because there's, if you go on YouTube, you look up like free will debunked, you're going to find like a bunch of YouTube videos. And I think the one I watched was Rationality Rules. He did a video on it. And so I'm going to respond to that briefly and then just move on.
Okay.
But first, we need to figure out the state of mankind. Okay. So people will argue that if God is all good, then why won't he stop evil, right? I mean, and I'm not trying to, honestly, I'm not trying to just overlook the problem. I honestly think it is a problem that atheists, it's the best atheist argument against theism.
Okay.
I will admit that it is. Trust me, I've read a lot of atheist arguments, and that the problem of evil is probably the number one best atheist argument. Like if I were an atheist, I would be arguing from that like point on. Okay, because it is just, it's something that Christians cannot just overlook. Okay, so it's very important that we, at least from a Christian's perspective, that I try to break it down the best I can. Okay, so before we can address it, we have to first understand the state of mankind. Okay. Now, I just explained to you in my presentation earlier what sin is. Okay.
Yeah.
Sin is a separation from God, is a separation from that fallen state. Okay, and I'm going to define sin in a minute. But I think we can both agree, and I think we can all agree that sin is not good. Okay. Sin is the cause of all the evil we see in the world. Okay. It is a very serious issue that all world religions recognize. Okay, pretty much every religion on the planet recognizes, at least the major ones. I can't say all of them, but the major ones recognize that there is a problem with humanity, that there's something deep inside us that is just, it's just so evil that we are just not good creatures at all.
All right.
And we decide to live in our world. We decide to live in a world of evil. We decide to live in that world. Now, free will is relevant. So now I'm going to process to free will. Okay. I say we do have free will. Okay, that's one of the central things in my response to the problem of evil. Okay. Now, I'm going to address an argument against that. An argument against free will is what's called the Leibniz experiments. I don't know if you heard of them, but
I'm not.
okay, let me try to explain it. So what it is the Leibniz experiments is where they look at your brain scans and they tell you to like consciously press a button, and they can predict 10 seconds before that decision that you're going to press that button. And so if you actually go on YouTube and look up rationality rules, he uses that argument where like we can predict what you're going to do 10 seconds before you press the button, so therefore free will doesn't exist. Okay.
Okay.
But the problem, my response to that would be this. Okay, and I'm not going to get into quantum mechanics or anything like that. I'm just going to keep it very simple. Is that there is a distinction between arbitrary choice and deliberate choice. So any Leibniz type argument, any Leibniz experiment is going to deal with arbitrary choices. What that means is like an arbitrary choice is something that's not important. Like let's say if I'm driving my car, or I'm just like, oh, I'm going to McDonald's, I'm going to order something. Like it's not really like no one, like you don't, it's not really important. But a deliberate choice is when you're consciously fully aware of something. Like let's say if you're going to decide to donate thousands of dollars to some organization, then your consciousness is more aware of that, right?
All right.
And so because your consciousness is more aware of that, then that choice is going to be more deliberate. It's not going to be just this random arbitrary choice that you decided to make. Like, no, it's going to be more important to your life. So therefore there's going to be more free will involved. And what's funny is like they actually did a study on this in 2018 last year.
Okay.
And what they found was that within deliberate choices, there was no readiness potential, that they could not predict what you're going to do 10 seconds because that choice was deliberate. And so what this basically shows is that any Leibniz type argument against free will is doomed from the start because of the fact that those experiments are only dealing with arbitrary choices and not deliberate choices. Okay. And so that is my response. You know, that's my response to rationality rules and any free will skeptic that's out there. That's my response. And so now that we're beyond that, we can say that we do have free will. Okay. Again, I can present a whole case for free will. I'm not going to do it because I don't have time. But
yeah,
there is free will. Okay, so we have the choice to do what we want. Okay, and that's what God made the world to be. Like God decided, like, okay, you can do what you want and whatever, and that's it. Right?
Yep.
And so when it comes to like Adam and Eve, for example, like Adam and Eve were our representatives on Earth. Like they were the best possible representatives, and they decided to disobey God, and they decided to do what they want. They wanted to be their own gods. And that's what we choose to a certain extent every day. That's what our sin is. What our sin is, okay, now I'm going to define what sin is, okay? Our sin, how you define sin, it's not just breaking God's law, okay? Sin is when you put your identity in anything other than God. And so if you were to put your identity in like your moral performance or anything else in life, that is, if that's what defined you, then that is sin, because you're putting your identity in something that's not God. And so then it would fundamentally be separate from God. And so that is what sin is. And in my view of hell, of course, is that you kind of like create your own hell, where if you choose to not be with God but with something else, then that something else will slowly disintegrate you. It will slowly destroy you, right? And so that's what hell is. It's separation from God, and it's where your own mind is like stuck in its own nightmare in some sense. Like whatever you decide to put your identity in, like that's what defined you. And if that thing doesn't last, well, guess what? It's going to create a living hell. Like if you decided to, like, let's say if you decided to put your whole identity on your career, but then you lost your career, well, that's going to destroy you, right? It'll become a living hell. Or if you decide to marry someone and you put your entire identity on that person and then they fail you, well, guess what? That's going to destroy you. That's what hell is. And so if that's what hell is, then what's heaven? Well, heaven is when you actually do put God as your identity. That's what heaven is. Okay. And so I just wanted to clarify, that's my view of hell, that's my view of heaven, very briefly.
Okay.
But when it comes to the problem of evil, okay, first of all, we need to understand we have free will. Okay, and I already addressed the number one objection, at least on the internet, against it. So if you don't, whatever. I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. So since we do have free will, we can do what we want. We can decide to put identity in anything that we want. Okay. Right. And
Yeah.
so if we don't decide to put our identity in Jesus, then whatever we do put our identity in is going to destroy us. It will become our hell.
That like the like believing that proverb, the rock and sand house building thing.
Right. If you don't put, exactly, like if you build your entire house on sand, it's going to fall apart. But if you build your house on rock, then it's going to stand. Exactly. You just proved my point. Like you can't build your entire identity on something that's not meant to last. And so when it comes to the problem of evil, like people would say like, well, why can't God, like, decide to stop murders? Well, if he does, that's going to destroy like the whole point in the first place. He wants us to experience a world that's fallen. He wants us to experience a world that's broken so that we can try to go back to him, so that we realize like, hey, this is not a good place to be in. So let's put our identity on God rather than something else so that we can be better. And I say that because I honestly do think that hell is really no more different than earth. I think the only difference between hell and earth, at least the only difference between hell and the life we're living right now on this planet, is that hell is where everyone lives forever. That's the only difference. Everything else is pretty much, I think, honestly going to be the same.
Okay.
And so, that's, sounds kind of weird, but that kind of is my take on that. And so, and again, we do live in a world of evil. And so there is going to be evil in hell. The only difference is that everyone's going to live forever. And, everyone's going to put their identity in something that's not God, and it'll slowly disintegrate them. It'll slowly destroy them. And so God's whole point was he wanted us to see a world that rejected him. And so he wants us to come back. He wants us to be with him again. Like that he wanted that. So that's kind of the whole point. Now, the other thing I need to address is, well, why can't there be a world where there is free will, but there's only people choose the good? Well, honestly, I don't think there's any possible world in which people have free will and always choose the good. I think we'd, you know, if there is no, and here's the other thing, okay, before I close off,
Okay.
is that if people complain, oh, well, why can't God give me a fresh start? Why can't he absolve all my sin? Why can't he do that? Like, I need a fresh start, whatever. Like, I did something wrong. I need a fresh start. He already did that on Calvary. He already did that on the cross. On my presentation earlier, he had to die to his own identity,
All right.
and he came back. So he already did what he needed to do to redeem us. He's already done what he needs to do to give us a fresh start. And so that's the whole point.
All right.
And so to conclude tonight, I honestly, talking about Genesis 1 again.
Back to where it all began.
Genesis 1, I think I take the functionalist interpretation. I think that Noah's flood was describing a global flood, even though it really wasn't scientifically a global flood, but it definitely was a big flood. I just don't think it was global. And then when it comes to the overall theme of the Bible, I do think that I think God's original plan was to have Adam and Eve subdue the earth, make the earth Eden, but then it failed the first time. So God's now trying to restore that, and I think he pretty much has with the cross, and he has with Jesus. And so now, as Christians, I think that I think it's important to realize that we need to put our identity in God, so that when the time comes, then we can make the entire universe his Eden.
All right. Well,
And that's pretty much it.
So it was nice to have you on here again. Maybe whenever you can come back again, you can talk about your other subjects like quantum physics or whatever. And
yeah, that's fine.
Well, is there any way people can contact you if they have questions?
Yeah, just you come find me on Facebook at Kyle Allender. I have a YouTube channel, but it's not that good. But just tell them to message you first, and then just you can tell them to message me afterwards if you want.
Well, remember, folks, never stop learning and enjoy the randomness. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.